before we start, I'm delighted to report that Will Wilder 2, The Lost Staff of Wonders, is now out in paperback. It's the second book in the Will Wilder series. I know a lot of you like paperback editions, and this one comes with an added bonus. Inside is a special preview chapter of Will Wilder 3. You can order the paperback edition of Will Wilder, The Lost Staff of Wonders now. Both books in the Will Wilder series are now available in hardback, paperback, and dynamic audio. Go to willwilderbooks.com, the EWTN Religious Catalog, Amazon, your independent bookseller, anywhere books are sold. Will Wilder 3 is coming soon. Now, here with analysis in New York is New York Times columnist and author of the new book, To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism. Ross Douthat, thank you for joining me. I want to get into why you decided it was time to write this book. I know you've been writing in your column about the Pope for years. Why now?
Well, that's as with any book, you started a couple years before it actually came out. So I probably started this sometime after the Second Synod on the Family and around the time that the Pope Francis came out with his document on family, marriage, and so forth, Amoris Laetitia. And it seemed to me at that point that I was in sort of a distinctive position. I'm a conservative-leaning Catholic who writes primarily for a secular audience in the pages of the New York Times. And that gives me, in certain ways, a certain independence, I think, in a way that isn't always true of people who cover the church, who feel, if they're conservative Catholics, they take a certain line. If they're more liberal Catholics, they take another. And my job is to explain what's happening in the church to secular readers. And I found that I was explaining what I think is honestly the most fascinating religious story of our time, which is something that I should say I think you've covered very well on your show. But, the Pope's very real concerted effort to shift Catholic doctrine and Catholic teaching in certain ways around marriage and sexuality, and all of the resistance that summoned up, all of the complexities of Vatican intrigue that, although I'm not a Vatican insider myself, I tried to rely on others to work into this book.
No, you quote liberally from Edward Penton and so many people who've been watching this and covering this so closely. What I love about it, Ross, it's a very sober read. This is not polemical, it's not nasty. I think it gives you an overview of why this matters. And as you say in the book, most Catholics don't even know that there's a controversy going on. They see a happy Pope, he says funny things about tattoos, he kisses babies. What's not to like? You see something more concerning here. What is it?
Well, I think Pope Francis has combined this incredibly impressive sort of public ministry, basically, that, it's not just sort of kissing babies, it goes beyond that. It's embracing men with boils, it's washing feet, it's doing things that really, I think, capture the world's imagination in a way that's very good for the church. But at the same time, I think it's clear that the Pope thinks that Catholicism, especially in the West, has to make a kind of peace with the sexual revolution. And the debate over communion for the divorced and remarried has been sort of the primary place where that battle has been fought. Those attempted reforms have been pushed. But the end result is, at least at the moment, a kind of decentralization of church teaching, where different churches in different dioceses and different countries and so on are being permitted to effectively experiment. And so you're ending up with the church having one teaching on marriage in Germany and a different one in Poland, or in the United States, one teaching effectively in Chicago and another in Philadelphia. And that's, I think it's not something that necessarily affects the everyday life of Catholics in the pews, and there are often good reasons why, it might be bad for your spiritual life to pay too much attention to Vatican politics. But in the scope of Catholic history, to have a Pope who is trying to change things that many people think can't be changed and meeting resistance and, making these kind of moves, it's a big story. It's a theological crisis that, whether I'm right or wrong about sort of, whether the Pope is right or wrong, people will be arguing about and thinking about, I think, for hundreds of years. And so we're sort of privileged as Catholic journalists to live in very interesting times for the church.
Oh, no, this is the biggest story. I agree with you. This is the biggest religious story, maybe in 30 or 40 years, and maybe since the Second Vatican Council. I'm just amazed at how many people ignore it. I guess it makes people uncomfortable. They don't want to be seen as in any way looking with a sober eye at the Pope. They want to just sort of cheerlead. And I understand that impetus, and as Catholics, you naturally support and love the Pope. But it does beg questions of us as journalists that I don't think you can turn your eye away from. I want to put something up, Ross. This is from your book. And you write about Cardinal Kasper, a man who this audience is certainly familiar with. He was the genesis, really, of this footnote in Amoris Laetitia that allows communion for divorced and remarried Catholics without an annulment under certain circumstances. You write, Cardinal Kasper had fastened on to the one reform that the Church should not contemplate, at least not without falling into self-contradiction and performing an auto-demolition on its own claim of authority. Explain that, and why, in your mind, this is such a dangerous place to be.
Well, it's a place where not only sort of church tradition and past Catholic teaching and recent papal statements are at stake. It's a place where the Church's teaching goes back to the New Testament and to the very words of Jesus himself. And that's why it's actually different in certain ways from other flashpoints around sexual morality and so on. It's the case that Jesus doesn't say anything about contraception in the Gospels. He doesn't say anything about homosexuality or same-sex marriage. But he does say something very clear and, to his own disciples' ears, very shocking about the indissolubility of marriage. And it's true that the Church has found, in the wake of the sexual revolution, various ways to make accommodations for the kind of chaos and disruption and disorder in which all of us live. And I should say I'm, a child and grandchild of divorce. I'm very intimately familiar with all the difficulties and complexities around these issues. Yeah. But the way the Church has found to make that compromise is to have an annulment process that essentially still tries to respect the idea that a marriage might be an indissoluble reality and that it deserves a kind of defense in the Church's own courts of law. And what Francis has effectively done, sort of ambiguously and allowing it in places where the local bishop wants to allow it, is something that goes beyond that. And it turns Church teaching on marriage into something that's more of sort of a pure abstraction, that notionally the Church has this teaching on indissolubility, but if your marriage fails, you can get an annulment. If you can't get an annulment, there's an easy path back to communion. Right. And I think what that means in the end is a version of what I said in that quote, that, to do that, 25 years after John Paul II taught essentially the opposite, raises profound questions about the nature and consistency of papal authority, which in turn I think is part of why, as you said, a lot of more conservative Catholics understandably don't want to delve too deeply into this. It's easier to just say, well, it's development of doctrine, and so it all has to make sense in the end. And the fact is that it's very hard for me, and I'm a lay Catholic, a journalist, I'm not a theologian, and so I certainly could be wrong, but it's very hard for me to see how you can call this development rather than just a kind of ambiguous reversal.
You see this a rupture? I mean, we keep hearing about the hermeneutic of continuity, that idea that one papacy flows organically into the next, and there's a continuity here. And there are many who say, look, this is contiguous with everything John Paul and Benedict taught. Do you believe that on the question of marriage?
No, I think you can obviously see if you read, if not Amoris Laetitia itself, the documents that have been promoted by various bishops and bishops' conferences. If you read them in parallel with statements from the last two pontificates on these questions, I don't think you see development. I think you see divergence. And Amoris Laetitia itself, in its more abstract portions, where it's talking about sort of the moral life writ large, seems to be in a kind of argumentative dialogue with Veritatis Splendor, John Paul II's famous encyclical on morality. It seems to be written by people who don't agree with what John Paul II said. And look, I mean, the reality is that a great swath of the Catholic intelligentsia believes in a hermeneutic of rupture. They believe that the Second Vatican Council was a more radical change in the life of the Church than John Paul II wanted it to believe, and that therefore we've had this sort of delay under John Paul and Benedict, but now we can sort of move forward. And that isn't the Pope's stated position. It isn't Francis's stated position, but the people he has empowered and the people around him see this as an opportunity to say, yes, the Church in effect began again in the early 1960s.
Bishops have told me, and cardinals in Rome, that the spirit of the Second Vatican Council was never fully realized. It is only now, under Pope Francis, that it is seeing its full blossom. Now, my argument back would be John Paul II and Benedict were actual participants in the Second Vatican Council. The people we're talking about now, they were children at the time, if they were alive at all. So it is a curious kind of historical blind spot, I think, that we can wait 50 years until the full realization of something happened, when the people who were there at the creation and even had a hand in drafting some of these documents might not know what the heck they meant in the first place. I mean, that strikes me as bizarre.
I imagine many of those bishops and cardinals saying that to you belong themselves to the generation that came of age, like Francis, just after Vatican II.
Correct.
Because part of what's interesting about this push for change or reform is that it is being carried out by a cohort that sort of came into power in the Church in the 70s and 80s, expected to sort of make a further set of changes, and then were effectively blocked by the last two popes. So it's an odd dynamic where, in many cases, younger figures in the hierarchy, and especially in the clergy, formed under John Paul and Benedict, are more conservative, and it's a sort of older liberals versus younger conservatives dynamic that's very unusual, I think,
it is.
and sort of reverses what you often would expect.
You use the terminology rigged and stage managed to describe that synod on the family. Explain that, and how do you think this upcoming synod on the youth might be following the pattern?
Well, I think rigged is the term of Edward Penton, the very talented Vatican journalist who you mentioned earlier. So it's his term, not mine. I actually prefer stage managed because, rigging implies a kind of illegitimacy, but it's strange, a little strange to talk about illegitimacy when the person doing the stage managing is, of course, the Pope himself, right? So I don't think there's anything necessarily unusual about the fact that Pope Francis worked to sort of push the synods on the family to a particular conclusion. When synods on the family under John Paul and Benedict were, if anything, sort of more controlled. What's distinctive is that, one, Francis did so while officially saying that, this was an open process in a way it hadn't been done under previous popes, and two, that what he was managing toward was an outcome that, again, would sort of shift the Church away from where the last two popes had ended up. But, I mean, the Synod on Youth, I would imagine that there is, at least to some extent, a similar dynamic. And again, it's not illegitimate. The Pope is the Pope, right? He's the supreme governor of the Church.
Right.
If he wants to hold a synod where the documents are written to aim at particular conclusions and people are selected to drive at particular conclusions, that is completely his right. But it is still the case that there's something odd about the rhetoric of, well, now we're going to listen openly to the youth, and it turns out that the youth are saying just the same things that this older generation of more liberal bishops and cardinals expects them to hear. But I don't know what the sort of ultimate intention for this synod is precisely, and there may not be one. I don't see something as clear as the Casper proposal on divorce and remarriage. It seems like if there's another big new push around an issue, it's more likely to happen with married priests and the synod that's focused on the Amazon, where the priest shortage is there. I'm not sure exactly when that's happening, but that's the case where it seems to me there's another particular liberalizing goal. The goal in the youth synod seems a bit more general, as far as I can tell. But you may know better than I.
Well, and I'm not saying yet, Ross. I'm putting something up on the screen. This is from your book. It says the papal message has lost any distinctively conservative element, instead offering simply liberalism in theology and left-wing politics, German theological premises, Argentine economics, and liberal Eurocrat assumptions on borders, nations, and migration. Talk to me a little bit about the way that, and this, this is a difference in emphasis, and to my mind, our thing is not central to the papacy, but you make the good point. The worldview has shifted here, in that you don't have a man who lived through World War II, and he has a more liberal South American view of the world. How has that changed or will change the church at large? Because these are non-doctrinal perspectives, but nonetheless, it's the Pope saying these things. Right. Turn your air conditioner off, knock the border walls down. He's saying that, and that means something.
And some of that is inevitable, I think, in the sense, and that's a very critical sounding passage you just quoted, and I want to stress that although I am a political conservative in the American context, I don't think there's any doctrinal danger to the Church in the Pope offering criticism of global capitalism, in more pungent terms than his predecessors did, and so on. That, again, is his right as a pope. And as the Church's center of gravity shifts to the global south, which it inevitably will to not just Latin America, but especially Africa, you are going to get from popes, I would imagine, more criticism of the global system and more statements that to us Americans, since we're sort of the center of that system and the most powerful country in the world, that sort of get our backs up a little bit. But I think one of the difficulties with this papacy is that when it started, it seemed to me that you could imagine that being combined with real sort of moral rigor on issues of marriage and sexuality and so on, that would in effect reassure people that the church, the leaders of the church might seem a bit left-wing on economics, but they were still clearly orthodox.
Right.
And the problem for Francis, it isn't per se that he's, that he takes the side of migrants and so on, though I don't agree with everything that he says about those issues in the European context, but it's that is combined with this sense of sort of, doctrinal drift, which leads then to the sense that many conservative Catholics have, which is why they, or we, I suppose, are conservative Catholics, that there is just this sort of general tug to the left that exists on economics and the environment and inevitably tugs on issues that are actually central to the faith as well.
Ross, I remember before the election, the conclave that elected Pope Francis, the talk in Rome, indeed the rationale for Benedict's retirement, was so that a younger, more reform-minded and capable man could come in and reform the Curia. Do you see that promise of curial reform taking shape under Pope Francis?
I don't think anybody does at this point. I think that, there have been some high-profile firings and there's been some reforming work done in various areas of the Vatican finances. The Pope does give sermons every year sort of criticizing corruption in his own Curia. But the structural stuff, the attempt to transform the bureaucracy from something that resembles a Renaissance court into something that can actually function in the 21st century, I don't think that has happened at all. And some of the people sort of charged with doing it, like Cardinal Pell, were blocked in various ways even before he ended up back in Australia facing charges. So no, I think what is true of Francis, and this is also true on sex abuse as well, is that he has a sort of powerful personal charisma, and he can sort of make sweeping gestures. He can, remove some bishops who tolerated or covered up sex abuse, which is something that Benedict, for all his achievements around sex abuse, didn't do. So Francis can make these gestures, but they're very personalized, and they don't translate into big structural reform. And again, even, I think even when I'm among people who are sort of strong admirers of the Pope, they will sort of shrug and joke a little bit about, well, next year, next year, we're going to get that big restructuring done in Rome.
Yeah.
And we're 5 years in, and it seems unlikely that it will actually happen.
Ross, before we run out of time, and we're almost up against the clock here, I want to share this one last quote from the book. You say, Francis has not just exposed conflicts, he has stoked them, encouraging sweeping ambitions among his allies and apocalyptic fears among his critics. He has not just fostered debate, he has taken sides and hurled invective in a way that has pushed friendly critics into opposition and undercut the quest for the common ground. Your thoughts on where the Church goes from here, and do you see any moderation from the Pope in the way he'll conduct the rest of this papacy?
I don't know his intentions, to be honest, and I try not, in the book, I try not to speculate too much about sort of, whether he had some comprehensive vision from the beginning or whether he, sort of took up Walter Casper's proposals and then reacted to conservative opposition. I would say, those of us who are critical of the Pope have to recognize that, we are always in danger of falling a bit into the trap of being the elder brother in the parable of the prodigal son, right? That, you have this Pope who sort of very clearly wants to go out to the peripheries, and we're there concerned about doctrine and maybe, proud of the fact that we've been going to Mass every Sunday and so on. And you have to scrutinize yourself and recognize that temptation. I think on that theme, though, in the parable of the prodigal son, when the elder brother gets his back up, the father does not turn and begin sort of berating him for closed-mindedness and rigidity. And I think just on the rhetorical level, the Holy Father's sort of determination to cast those who are sort of concerned about the integrity of Catholic doctrine as Pharisees and fundamentalists has been a big rhetorical mistake. And it's made it harder than it should be going forward to find common ground. But I'm very uncertain. The book, again, the book is not written in a spirit of certainty about, the Church can't change absolutely, and so Francis must be defeated or something. I think, part of the humility of being a Catholic, daring to criticize the Pope, is to recognize that you could be wrong, and there are a lot of possible scenarios that could work themselves out in the Church as this, as the Francis era's effects are felt over years and decades to come.
And as you point out in the book, rightly, the Pharisees were the ones who were attacking Jesus on the marriage question. It was Jesus who took the more rigid position on divorce and marriage, not the Pharisees, not the doctors of the Church. So it is a curious rhetorical casting there by the Pope.
What Jesus often seems to do when he's attacking legalism that's used as a way to evade the moral law. So he's saying, look, the Pharisees, you have these complicated legal structures that allow people to get divorced, but in the beginning God made them male and female, and you're using your legal acumen to evade moral obligations. And I think that too, is sort of, that is missing in the way that the Pope and many of his allies sort of read New Testament debates into our own equally fraught era.
Well, it's a thought-provoking read, fascinating, to kind of see it all in one place, and the drama that I cover, I cover every act and beat. To see it all put together this way, I thought was very instructive. Ross Douthat, thank you for being here. The book is To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism. It's available now in bookstores everywhere and online. Ross, thanks again.
Thank you, Raymond.